All right, you're live.
All right. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers Atlanta Metro Chapter, I want to welcome you to our monthly dinner meeting presentation. However, before we get going, I'd like to make a few announcements. The first one is I'd like to make a pitch for if you have not already joined the National Society of Professional Engineers, I encourage you to do so. It is the national organization that represents and advocates the interest of professional engineers. By joining, you join at the three different levels: national, at the state chapter, also at the local chapter, and it is a great way as well to great way for you to become involved in the society, help out, and also to accumulate PDH points. Okay. I also want to ask you to follow us on several different social media, Meetup, YouTube, the LinkedIn group, Facebook, and not just join us and follow us, but also encourage your colleagues to join us as well and to follow us. I'd like to also make an announcement regarding Math Counts. Math Counts is the chapter's, actually NSPE's major event. It is a competition for middle schoolers, 7th and 8th graders. It starts at the local level, which is where we're recruiting coordinators to help out. That goes on to the state and the national. Math Counts is a golf tournament looking for folks to come in and have a great time. This will take place next month, October 9th. But we're also looking for sponsors. So if somebody at your company would like to support us in this cause, greatly appreciate it. Would also like to make an announcement regarding the GEF, the Georgia Engineering Foundation. Deadline for applications for scholarships is coming up September 26th. And with that, I will turn it over to Steve to introduce our presenter for tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jesus. You have a good evening. All right, and everybody, I would like to just very briefly welcome Dr. Jason Borenstein from Georgia Tech. I'll let him tell you more about himself, but Jason is a longtime friend of the Atlanta Metro Chapter and the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers. So pleased to have him speak with us again. And Jason, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with GSPE, Atlanta Metro Chapter again. Certainly nice to be back. I was telling Steve right before we started that I got my cup ready from the last time I spoke from the GSPE chapter. So I'm grateful to have the opportunity again to speak today. Just to do a brief introduction beyond what Steve just said, yes, I'm a professor at Georgia Tech. I've been there for well over a decade and a half now. I'm divided between the School of Public Policy, which is in the Ivan Allen College, where I teach a variety of different kinds of ethics courses, including engineering ethics for ABET accreditation. And I also work for the Office of Graduate Studies, where I run our campus's Responsible Conduct of Research program, which relates to topics such as authorship, peer review, working with human subjects, research misconduct, and a variety of other topics. As you can see from the title of today's discussion, which I will hope that it's going to be a discussion, so please add comments or questions in the chat. I cannot see them myself, but Steve can see them and he can read them off to me later on as we go through this. So certainly feel free during the course of this presentation to ask questions, and I'm happy to stop at any point to discuss them. Anyhow, in terms of today's discussion, it'll be about AI and ethics, which is well within my topical space in terms of the research that I conduct. So just to clarify, as I've been alluding to already, my expertise is in ethics. I often work with engineers and computer scientists, but my foundational expertise is in ethics. And I'll just reiterate something here that I would like to thank GSPE, especially Steve Strong and Roger Grabman for the invitation. and all the others who were involved in planning this event. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak today. This is my presentation outline, which essentially you'll see my plan from here. I'll give a little bit of background on the space of artificial intelligence and why we're concerned about it from an ethical perspective, or at least the benefits, drawbacks, opportunities, etc. I'll talk a bit about specific ethical challenges as we go forward, and then talk about professional organizations and conclude with some final thoughts. So to give some background on this space, I am not going to endeavor to try to provide precise definitions for artificial intelligence. I think computer scientists and engineers are better served at doing that task. It has, as we likely know, something to do with deep learning, machine learning, perhaps neural networks. I will just assume for today's discussion that we have some, perhaps different understanding, but probably at least to some degree overlapping understanding of what artificial intelligence means. And for today's discussion, I will try to give a broad survey of ethical issues relating to artificial intelligence. But given that artificial intelligence may now already be integrated into a variety of systems and may continue to be integrated into a continuing amount of systems, I can't, of course, do justice to all applications of artificial intelligence, but I will try to pay some special attention to the sorts of AI applications, AI systems that individual people, individual customers, individual members of the public might interact with. For example, chatbots and self-driving cars will also be a focus of attention. Another point of clarification as we're starting things out is a frequently voiced concern about artificial intelligence is potential existential threats. So every few years or so, with the resurgence of different forms of AI or different forms of machine learning, etc., corresponding to those resurgences of AI tends to be concerns that, well, are these science fiction scenarios of potential existential threats to human beings? Is there any validity to those concerns? Is it a real threat? And I'll just deliberately say in the front end that I'm not going to confront that subject matter in today's discussion. If you, of course, want to raise it, I can say a few things about it, but I prefer to stick to more grounded day-to-day near-term concerns rather than the existential threats that tend to draw people's attention. There are, of course, luminaries in computing around 5 years ago or so who were discussing these threats, and I'll leave it to them and others to discuss it. But again, it will not be my primary concern for today. So jumping into things, again, the plan is to discuss an overview of ethical issues. And for each one, if there's something you would like me to say more about, questions, etc., again, feel free to write in the chat, and I'll try to leave over time for Steve to draw to my attention, and I will try to respond to your comments or questions. So as you might expect, privacy is going to be a starting kind of issue that people will discuss related to artificial intelligence. So I do not claim to be the first to discuss this kind of topic matter. Obviously, many have been discussing it in various different kinds of forms, various different iterations over the decades. As you would expect, privacy is a big issue, in part because if you combined artificial intelligence systems, algorithms, agents with big data, it potentially enables them to learn lots about the world. And that's often intentional, is for AI to be able to generate patterns, for instance, from medical records or from weather patterns, etc. So the potential concern, of course, is, well, might there be unanticipated worries about how it might impact our privacy? So we'd like to believe, at least to some degree, that we have some form of privacy that we still preserve. But we do need to worry to some degree, of course, if we do have some remnants of privacy, how do we go about protecting it? So if you're not familiar with the first example, and it's not an AI-specific example, but the first example has to do with the Target coupon story. Again, not AI-specific, but it's something that kind of highlights some of the worries that are already emerging. So for those not familiar, just very briefly, a father and teenage daughter were living together in a household. And the teenage daughter was shopping at the store Target. And over time, she was getting coupons at their joint home, at the home that they lived in together. And some of these coupons turned out to be for diapers and baby bottles and things of that sort. And it turned out that Target had learned that the teenage daughter was pregnant before the father knew. So, of course, this raised all sorts of issues, among other things, that the father learned about his teenage daughter's pregnancy from Target, from the coupons that were being sent to his daughter. So this obviously can raise a variety of different kinds of concerns, including in the realm of privacy, about what may or may not have been anticipated based on the customer purchasing practices. And there are various other examples more specific to the realm of AI, I would say, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these are at least some of the examples of where AI might go and where we might need to think about the privacy-related kinds of concerns. So, for example, if through proxies, through different kinds of data that may reveal a person's illnesses, medical illnesses, like if you're studying how fast or slow a person types on a keyboard, or how fast they're responding to different kinds of apps, will that potentially reveal something about underlying illness that potentially the person might not even know about? And now an employer, for example, might learn something about based on the data. If you're not familiar, I'm guessing many of you might be already, but I'll just mention it briefly. HireVue and other similar products are already using AI in some form or fashion to screen applicants for potential jobs. It's not the only company in this space. There are various others, but HireVue is one that's drawn a fair amount of attention. And there are some wonders about how the screening process is going to work, what potentially it might reveal about the candidates that maybe they didn't fully anticipate, etc. And then the other ones there, you can just read off that there was some buzz about 2 or 3 years ago about whether you can infer someone's sexual orientation from a facial image, which you might imagine for a variety of reasons that might be problematic. So not only because of potential inaccuracies, but potential discrimination and potential physical harm in regions of the world where someone who may be homosexual or gay might be discriminated against or beaten or again, physically harmed as a result of their sexual orientation. So these are among the sorts of things that emerge in the realm of privacy. Now, I'll take a breath for a second and just do a quick check-in with Steve and see if we have anything that I should stop on at this point.
No, nothing at the moment.
Okay, so just keep me apprised if I need to pause for comments or questions. And just, again, if there's something I can address, happy to do so.
Absolutely.
So the next one has to do with complexity and transparency. For today's purposes, I am not going to distinguish or define explainability and transparency. In some documents, in some circles, they will use these terms interchangeably. In some circles, they do not use the words explainability and transparency interchangeably. For our purposes today, essentially what we're getting at is, will the users and potentially the designers of these systems, but will the users especially understand how these systems work? So for example, if you're going into a medical office and you have an AI diagnostic tool that tells you that you have a certain type of skin cancer, will the patient understand how the AI tool came to that recommendation, or how that came to the diagnosis, I should say? So when you interact with a doctor, for example, you typically can ask that doctor questions. You can ask him or her questions about how they came to that solution, what they saw on, a biopsy, or what they saw in a photo of the skin. But if you're interacting with an AI tool, it's not always necessarily clear how the AI came to the decision, how it came potentially to a recommendation, if that's what its purpose is. So what we potentially worry about in this space is not only whether the user might understand to a suitable degree how the AI system works, but do the people interacting with it, like the clinicians, understand how it's coming to its recommendation or diagnosis? And keep in mind, for those who are not in this space directly of healthcare, that AI systems are making their way into the healthcare realm including by looking at x-rays and potentially trying to diagnose what the condition is. Similarly, we could raise similar kinds of questions about autonomous vehicles, which is near and dear to one of my research areas, the ethics of autonomous vehicles. Will we know how these AI systems will navigate through traffic? Do we know, and I don't necessarily want to focus on this today, but I'll mention it quickly, the so-called no-win scenario or true ethical dilemma, how the AI system is going to make its decision, for example, on whether to steer off the road or potentially to hit a pedestrian when there's not enough time to brake fully. So again, these are some of the challenges in the space of AI related to complexity and the potential lack of transparency in terms of how these systems work. So this one may be of interest if you have not heard of this before. So I'm kind of combining two overlapping issues, two issues that can intersect here. So what I'm essentially getting at is, might a user, a person, a customer perhaps, when they're interacting with a customer service representative, might the person not realize that they're interacting with an AI? So for example, many of you probably have booked flights a while ago, perhaps dealt with something with your bank or credit card, and there's a little pop-up when you're on the company's website, can I help you? At times, that can I help you might be a human being, but times is definitely not. So I'll point you towards that graphic, the bottom right, Rachel Brooks. So about 2 to 3 years ago, when I was doing some research on chatbots, so more or less interactive AI, perhaps AI encoded with AI, but interactive agents that can have a discussion with human beings, often online. Rachel Brooks is a chatbot, is essentially a computing agent that tries to sell companies other computing agents. So it is a sales agent for that company that tries to sell chatbots to other companies. So I thought that was an extra layer of interest, at least in my opinion, to a chatbot that tries to sell you other chatbots. Let me draw your attention to the picture on the top right. So that person does not exist. So it's from a website, and I have the link towards it towards the end if any of you are interested in this. Essentially, the website is "this person does not exist." So essentially, it's an amalgamation of pictures. So that person is an amalgamation of pictures of other people. And we might start to worry that the sorts of people we're interacting with don't exist. They might be AI agents, they might be programmed to other people, of course, to deceive us. So that term deepfakes, which at times has meant using the footage of real people in deceptive ways. So there have been images of celebrities and politicians where potentially they are made to say things they never truly said through deepfake kind of techniques. Well, deepfake not only goes there, it goes into the space of potentially having a person who never existed have a conversation with us, for example, online. So again, that's from a website from that it's essentially called "this person does not exist," is where that picture is from.
Hey, Jason, I'm curious myself,
Sure.
on these chat bots, do you know if they get to a point where the user asks a question that the computer doesn't know how to respond to? Does it do something like, hold on and I'll transfer you to somebody else who can help kind of thing, or do you know how that works?
Good question. It depends on the company. The typical default is, for many companies now, if it's using a chatbot, it will at least start you with a conversation and try to remedy standard kinds of problems. Like, for instance, if it's a credit card company, it'll try to address questions about, do you want to know your balance? Or do you need to know the phone number for the company, or something like that? And normally when you stump it, or when you ask it a question, it's not programmed to answer. It might start to steer you in the direction of, let me get a person to help you with that. But there is variability, of course, depending on the company, but that's pretty standard kind of practice. Well, it'll be able to more or less operate off of a script, maybe a certain set of questions that is programmed to try to answer. But if it goes beyond that, they probably have to ask a human for help at that point in time.
Okay, thanks.
And I actually interacted with one not that long ago. I think it was a bank sweat. It was a bank or credit card. I can't remember which, but I did interact with one not that long ago. And they can, depending on the sophistication, depending on, of course, what type it's being used, they can answer usually some basic rudimentary kinds of questions. But I figured that picture of the person who does not exist might be at least of interest if you've not heard of that before. It came to my attention from a computing meeting that I was in not that long ago, about a week or two ago. The gender of the AI. So of course, it's a computing system, it's computing technology. And one of the things we typically might want to think about in this space is what kinds of features, let's say, a chatbot could have. So the sorts of things that you interact with on a travel's website or a credit card company's website. Should it have a gender? So one of the arguments for having a gender is human beings tend to bond better with things that have names. And typically, if something has a name, it usually, not always, but it usually tries to indicate some form of gender. So for instance, if it has the name Susan, we often assume, although maybe not always, but we often assume that if it's Susan, probably the person might be female. If the name is John, we might assume the person is more likely to be male. And again, some of the reason for doing this in AI with a chatbot or a physically embodied robot, which is one of my other research areas, is human-robot interaction, the ethics of human-robot interaction. Sometimes it's argued that gender can help in terms of more user acceptance. Well, there are arguments back and forth for this. As I said, some of the arguments for would be perhaps better user acceptance. One of the arguments against potentially engendering or adding a gender to an AI or physically embodied robot is whether it might perpetuate stereotypes. And I try to give a quick example of this towards the bottom, is if you're creating a robot to be used in a kindergarten setting and you give it female type traits that are more traditionally female or stereotypical female, does that perpetuate stereotypes that maybe people might find problematic? In fact, many female roboticists have tried to combat these kinds of stereotypes in the robots they create by giving them names that are maybe not as stereotypical as they would have been historically. So again, this is another space potentially of focus in terms of whether to gender or not. And I'm not necessarily weighing in on one answer or the other today. I'm just bringing it to your attention as another in the considerations that we might want to discuss. Now, in terms of...
oh, sure. Sorry, if this is a good time, we do have a couple come in.
Sure.
Tom, and this is more of a statement, and I'll let you address it if you choose to, and then we have a question. Tom says, companies waste too much of the customer's time trying to answer questions the customer doesn't want to ask.
Spending too much time answering questions the customer doesn't want to ask.
Right.
Maybe I just want to make sure I'm getting this correct. So essentially causing the customer to jump through hoops they don't necessarily want to go through?
I think that's the intention, yes.
Yeah, and I think that probably would occur, and of course depends on the interaction, in other words, what kind of company. But that probably will occur to some degree with any company, and perhaps because for security verification. I don't know if that's what, who was it, Tom? I think was the name.
Yes, Tom.
What Tom had in mind. But security verification is one of the reasons we potentially have to jump through hoops, so to speak. And companies, of course, are trying to react to this by having pre-verification of different sorts. For example, at least one of the companies I interact with have recorded my voice. So when I call in, that's one of the ways they recognize me, so I don't have to do as many security verifications going through. Not to say that's perfect, because my voice could be copied and used, not to give anyone bad ideas, but yes, there is some hoops that we potentially have to jump through in these systems. And this may potentially be a problem with AI, where the AI has to get enough information about the user so it can interact with the person.
Yeah. Okay, so Tom actually said yes, that was right on, and then he also said, or that the questions have obvious answers that the informed customer already knows. And I know that part I've encountered myself, but sometimes it may seem obvious. I know from my point of view is helping customers in some very complex projects myself, and they don't always know what you think they should know.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to anticipate what a customer does or does not know. That's why sometimes you have to go through the script to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, because I've made assumptions that they were more knowledgeable than they were and missed the obvious, kind of did you plug it in thing. So thanks, Tom.
Did you turn it on and off again?
Yeah, exactly. We actually had somebody who didn't hit the power switch and was wondering why it wasn't working. But
Right.
yeah. So Phil has a couple questions, actually. First, he says, what constitutes the fine line between privacy breach and the protection of individuals from terrorism?
Oh boy, that's a long conversation. And I'm not claiming to be a security expert, so there may be people better able to answer that. But at least some of the considerations, of course, is protecting the individual person against the interests of society. And again, there's long conversations about this in ethics and law, in engineering and scientific circles. And I don't promise to give a simple answer to it because it's not a simple question, and there are unfortunately no simple answers. At least part of the answer, which will not be a complete one, but it may be part of the puzzle, is how much does the person know when they're giving up their data? Do they know that this data is going to be stored? Do they know it's potentially going to be shared with third parties? Do they potentially know it's going to be gathered by governmental entities? Which is not to say in all occasions is the individual person entitled to know that a government is collecting the information. Perhaps there are arguments for and against that, which again, I'm not going to try to resolve today. But at least part of the puzzle is having a meaningful conversation about what the person whose data it's from, what they do or do not know about data use. So I think there's a robust conversation that could start there.
Okay.
And I think you said you had other comments or questions?
Yeah, the other question Phil had was, what legal problems arise from the use of video analytics with CCTV systems?
You mean like I assume it probably means something like in a place of employment. So if, for example, if I'm not correct about the context you have in mind, please let me know. So for example, if you're using cameras in a place of employment and using facial recognition or something of that sort to see who's coming in and out of a region, coming out in and out of a room, who's going through security, things of that sort.
Right, and I can tell you, I also my company dabbled in that several years ago, and we had the ability to do things like detect whether a vehicle was driving the wrong way on a street, or look for behavior, perhaps in a retail environment that seems suspicious, potential shoplifting, and it would simply draw attention to the human to that screen so that the human can decide whether or not, yes, that's really a theft in progress, or no, it's nothing.
Honestly, I'm probably not the best person to be able to be keeping up with the law on what is allowable with closed circuit TV and those other applications at this point. It's hard to keep up.
How about more an ethical perspective than a legal perspective?
Right. Well, I maybe get to that a little bit. I was just going to quickly say something about that. I know with facial recognition systems for policing, many companies have said that they're going to step back for a little while and potentially reevaluate, although the terms of what that means is not always clear. So for instance, IBM and Microsoft, among others, have said that they were going to step back a little bit from facial recognition in policing, but I'm not fully sure what that means in practice in the short or long term. But yes, going back, Steve, to what you were saying from an ethical perspective, again, that's one of those real messy ones. In part, I think it depends on what you're warning people about, whether you're giving them some sense of that cameras are used in this space, that if you walk through public areas, you're likely to be photographed. Is there some general understanding amongst the public that the region is under surveillance? I think that's at least part of the puzzle. And I think there needs to be good controls over what that information is used for. I think that's been a problem in past cases where you might promise that the technology is being used strictly for policing, But then it has the secondary use of, well, maybe the person who's watching the footage is just curious about who's walking in the area and is not necessarily observing crime. So I think we do need to be careful not only about what the public knows about these surveillance technologies, but not only that, whether there are ways to control the secondary uses that perhaps weren't anticipated when the technologies were being released into public areas.
Okay, and yes, Phil did confirm he was talking about facial recognition and position tracking. So I think you addressed that.
Yeah, facial recognition, of course, is getting a lot of attention.
Yes. And then another one just came in. Earl's asking, to what extent are email files used to build personal data files?
To what extent are email files? So, like, for example, companies, your traffic
That's
going
right.
back and forth, how much are they collecting a profile, for example, how much you're working or what kinds of keywords you're sending back and forth, not only to people inside the company, but outside the company. At least that's my interpretation of the question.
Yeah, or you possibly even, Earl, chime in if we're not on target here, but possibly even just for advertising or marketing purposes as well.
Well, that's a whole conversation because there's all sorts of tracking tools, including cookies and other things that are following you all over the place on the internet. And there are probably many others who are better able to speak to that particular part of it in terms of what's following you on the internet and how granular the information is. Whereas we might be promised the information is aggregate. Do they really know more about us individually than we think? And they probably do. Some companies probably do.
Google, for example.
Sorry, go ahead.
Google, for example, I would think knows quite a lot about anybody who uses Gmail.
Probably, yes. I think that's a pretty safe assumption. Now, of course, I don't obviously work for Google, but I imagine they have a fair profile on most of us who have interacted with Google technology. In terms of email, I think that's difficult for me to comment on because I don't know what companies do internally. I do know they tell their employees that your email may be scanned, may be collected, may be stored. But what they actually do with that information is difficult for me to know as an outsider. So I know many companies are in this practice of collecting emails and potentially, if they have a problematic employee, potentially reviewing emails to see if there were any warning signs or seeing if there was any inappropriate behavior with other coworkers. But what companies are doing more specifically than that is hard for me to answer as an outsider. So unfortunately, I don't know if I'm the best expert on that one.
Yeah, and he also did bring up another, I guess, a follow on to that. How about for job searches? And I can tell you while you're taking a sip there, at a former employer, a colleague of mine had taken a job with a competitor company, and the IT department, apparently the competitor, when they announced that he was going to be joining them in a month or a few weeks or whatever it was, made the mistake of sending it to his current employer email address as a copy. And the IT department somehow flagged that, and needless to say, he was walked out the door pretty much on the spot instead of filling out his remaining time.
Right. Thanks, Steve, for that example. Rightly, and definitely depending on the company, they don't want IP or intellectual property taken, for example, if they don't necessarily trust the employee is loyal to them anymore and may have a foot out the door. So you can imagine that many companies, a large number of them, would be very careful about what that person might continue to have access to right before they leave. So quite right, they might want to have that information that the employee has taken another job rather quickly. Not to say it's problem-free to do that, but again, a conversation perhaps for another day on that particular point. But it is something that companies are likely doing already.
Okay, thanks everybody. That's what we got for the moment. I'll let you continue.
Okay, good. And just let me know, obviously, as we go on, if there are others. Future of work. So at least some of this, as you imagine, the COVID era has potentially intensified some of these concerns. But essentially, will AI, in conjunction with it, robots, potentially replace humans? So a lot of the promise of AI and robots is to complement or work with human beings. Co-robots is one of the phrases often used by the National Science Foundation and others to indicate a robot that's designed to work with a human being. Again, the term is co-robot, is one of the phrases often used. Well, something that's designed as a co-robot to help complement a human worker, after time might end up replacing them. So for instance, in autonomous vehicles, where you might have automated systems that help assist, let's say, a taxi driver or an Uber driver, not be in an accident, over time, might the autonomous system replace the human driver? And of course, we do need to worry if there aren't measures put in place about potential job loss and which sectors the job loss might occur. And in part, what I mean by that in terms of the job sectors is, yes, with AI and robots, you do open up a lot of jobs for the sorts of people that probably are listening to this event. So most of the people on this event are likely engineers, given the focus of GSPE. And of course, yes, AI and robots will potentially open up opportunities, job opportunities for computer scientists, engineers, and others. But who potentially is going to be automated out? The taxi driver, the truck driver, customer service representatives, travel agents obviously have disappeared, not entirely, of course, but to a large degree because of automation, the internet, and other sorts of things. So we do need to worry about how it's potentially going to change or alter the workplace, what kinds of skills might be needed to be successful in the workplace, and who potentially might have difficulty finding work in the future. And I suspect the folks on this event are familiar with SAE levels of driving automation, but just in case, there's a scale from 0 to 5 in terms of how much driving automation a car might have. 0 meaning a traditional car with no true automation. Level 4 to 5 would essentially mean an autonomous vehicle that can operate in most, if not all, conditions without human supervision. So 5 would be level 5 of driving automation, would essentially be no need for a human being in the car in order for the vehicle to operate. Trust calibration. This is one of my research areas, and I may briefly just mention this. But essentially, the overarching issue is, how do we make sure, meaning the scientific, engineering, STEM community more broadly, how do we make sure people do not place too much trust in autonomous technology, AI-related technology, robots, or other computing devices? Overtrust meaning, essentially, the technology does not have the capability to do what the user thinks it can do, and or the technology really can't keep you safe when you think it can. So that would be overtrust, where you project onto the technology more than it's actually capable of doing. Or undertrust, where essentially if you allow the technology to operate, it might be safer, but you're just tempted to intervene because you don't know what the technology is doing. And occasionally this has happened, unfortunately, with airplane pilots, human pilots in an airplane, and autopilots of an airplane, where the human pilot doesn't necessarily know what the autopilot is doing and how it's reacting, and may intervene at time intervals where it probably should not be. And many folks in aerospace engineering and other realms work in this kind of space of trying to calibrate trust. Well, here, human factors more generally would be another space where they're, of course, working on calibrating trust. Here, I'm just bringing attention to the different kinds of AI applications. So the one mentioned on the right, Wobot, is essentially a therapy kind of chatbot. And even saying it's a therapy chatbot might project onto it capabilities, functionality it really does not have. So if you think it's going to be able to identify, clinical depression in someone, it might not be able to do that, even though the person thinks, well, it's going to help me, so shouldn't I trust it? So again, we have to have the right level of trust calibrated in the technology, and there are different approaches for doing that depending on the technology. So one of the ways is, of course, warning the person that if you need assistance with depression, please contact a therapist rather than continuing to use the chatbot. So that would be one example. For those who have not heard of the ELIZA effect, which mentioned on the first bullet point towards the bottom here. It was a relatively simple chatbot in the early days of chatbots in the 1960s, where Weizenbaum, a computer scientist, was developing a technology to see how people would interact with it. And again, being in the 1960s, it was well before our current age, current times, in terms of the development of chatbots. And even then, people were projecting onto the chatbot, again, traits, functionality it didn't possess, and it happened relatively quickly. And then I'll just, with this slide, conclude about an AV's autopilot. We've already unfortunately seen some tragic cases where trust calibration needed to be improved with the fatalities in cases including the Tesla fatality in Florida several years ago, the Tesla fatality in California, and the Uber-related fatality in Arizona, where in that case, it was a pedestrian who was walking a bicycle that was struck by an Uber vehicle.
Yeah, and Earl brings up, I think I know what he meant here. He says job loss is expected to cause major job losses for over-the-road truck drivers. I think he's just saying this level of automation.
Yes, and in the United States, I believe, at least the last time I looked, the estimate is between about, I think somewhere in the ballpark of about 3 to 4 million truck drivers. So if they're all automated out, that's roughly 3 to 4 million people who would need other forms of work, assuming they don't want to retire. And that, again, doesn't include taxi drivers, part-time drivers, other sorts of drivers. So yes, certainly there's large-scale impact if it gets automated out.
Mm-hmm.
Bias. So there's been a lot of discussion in this space of AI and bias. Probably for today, I'll largely focus on facial recognition, which is one of the examples of bias. But essentially what we're talking about here is, may AI inherit in some manner or fashion the biases of its creators or designers? So part of it is knowing that you need a robust set of data to train the AI algorithm, and perhaps not fully realizing that the data sets that train these algorithms maybe don't fully represent human population, the broader population. So if that's too general, the specific example of this from the literature, and that has to do again with the facial recognition example towards the bottom here, is that a lot of the facial recognition systems that have already been tested to some degree, including from Microsoft, Google, IBM, and some others, they tend to more reliably identify white males. And then it gets worse with females, and it gets even worse with people of color, especially Black individuals. So the most reliable that you're going to get with facial recognition is a white male. The most unreliable in general is a Black female. And a lot of that has to do with the training data sets. In other words, how the facial recognition systems were trained, what they were used to learn from, in other words. And because of this, it potentially can lead to very serious problems. In this particular case, a facial recognition, you might arrest, of course, the wrong person. You might, ruin someone's reputation when they were nowhere near the place when you accuse them of trespassing or something else. And building off of that, in terms of, again, I sometimes bring the example to autonomous vehicles. How are we training the sensors for autonomous vehicles? So are they going to be as reliable with white pedestrians and pedestrians that are people of color? So we do wonder whether the testing has been robust enough with LiDAR or other kinds of sensors that autonomous vehicles might end up using. Are they going to be equally reliable on different populations? There are, of course, other questions too about whether they're going to be able to reliably detect small children and things of that sort. But again, the overarching issue that I'm just bringing attention to here is bias that might lurk in the AI.
I wonder if a lot of mainstream television programs don't do a huge disservice here as well, because a lot of times they make it sound like facial recognition, you snap your fingers and a few seconds later they have the criminal guaranteed kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, within 5 minutes, you have 97% match.
Mm-hmm.
And, it makes potentially for good television, arguably, but it doesn't necessarily make for good reality. It doesn't necessarily
Right.
reflect on our reality. I mean, there's all sorts of things that, yes, do work more reliably in TV than in reality.
Yeah.
For those who are potentially interested in this space, I will point you towards this reference of Eubanks here of 2018. It's a book called Automating Inequality, which was one amongst many books about 2 to 3 years ago that was really drawing attention to these kinds of concerns. In her book, she was talking a lot about recidivism, amongst other examples. Nudging behavior. And again, if there's anything that I'm missing, Steve, just wave me down. Nudging behavior. This has been one of my research areas with Ron Arkin, who's a colleague at Georgia Tech. He's a computer scientist. And essentially, we're looking into conceptually. We haven't done studies on empirical studies on this, but we were examining it conceptually. Under what circumstances might it be okay for an AI system or a robot to nudge you in a behavioral direction? So essentially, what we mean by this is, how could it push you without force, without physically forcing you, but just trying to encourage you to change your behavior? So for instance, if any of you have a Fitbit, it could nudge you to exercise more, for example. So this could be encoded in AI systems where it could remind you to stop smoking, to exercise more, remember to call your parents, remember to call your other family members, which essentially is what this EloQ device, the one mentioned on the right hand here, it was supposed to be designed, as it says there, for older adults that help encourage them to interact with family members so they don't get too lonely or don't become too isolated, for example. But is these sorts of techniques or strategies acceptable? I will say that IEEE, amongst other entities, has been looking at this to some degree, and I'll speak about that more a bit later on. Dual use, and I'm getting pretty close to the end of the ethics examples, and then I'll try to wrap it up shortly after that. Dual use essentially has two main definitions. One is more in the military side of things, often used in military circles. The same or similar technology can have military applications, but it also could have civilian applications. I'm using a slightly different definition that often appears in the biomedical side of the universe. Could the same or similar technology or information have beneficial applications, but also be maliciously twisted to cause deliberate and significant harm to the public? And so here you can see a couple examples towards the bottom where we might worry about where technology we might think could be useful and help protect the public could be twisted to harm the public. So we might worry, for instance, about, yes, we do potentially want devices to identify criminals so they don't harm others, but could they be used, those same technologies, to identify, potentially harass people who are peaceful, including in other regions of the world that potentially don't allow free speech? So these sorts of concerns are another ethical kind of consideration. So this is where I'm going to take it to some discussion about IEEE. It's not necessarily to signify that it's the only engineering organization that's important in this space, but it's at least one that's directly talked about AI and intelligent systems. So if you've not seen this before, for those of you who are IEEE members or at least curious about this, IEEE modified its code of ethics roughly 3 years ago, including adding that language in the blue towards the bottom here, that part of the code of ethics is taking into account ethics related to intelligent systems. Other things that professional organizations have been doing, IEEE again has its series called Ethically Aligned Design, where it tries to give you an overview of ethical issues related to AI and robots. Some of it overlaps with some things I've said today. In the interest of disclosure, I did have some small role with that report. I was on its effective computing committee, and I also have said things about nudging and other sorts of things that made its way into that report. But again, I had a small role amongst many others who created that report. IEEE's employees, amongst others, had much more to do with the report than I did. And then there are other items listed here that are getting at some of the issues I've mentioned. Especially a lot of them are concerned about bias, which is, again, one of the things I mentioned today, and trust. Another thing to say about IEEE is that it's trying to create technical standards in this space at the intersection of AI, intelligent systems, and ethics. Just tried to give you an example of one of the technical standards that's been underway, been in the developmental process for a few years now. It's P7010. So essentially, for those of you not terribly familiar, but there are obviously many of you who are probably more familiar with these technical standards than I am, it's essentially trying to give standards for development, standards for engineers in terms of when they're developing their technologies and what kinds of practices are allowable. So here it's trying to align, again, when you're developing AI, robots, other intelligent systems, with human well-being. So I'll give some concluding thoughts, as it says here, and then hopefully we have some time for additional questions, discussion related to this topical space. So my goal here today was to at least introduce you to some, and it's a subset, but at least some of the ethical issues related to AI, including things such as concerns about bias, privacy, trust in AI, etc. Want us to keep in mind the context. If we, as part of the STEM community broadly, so I'm an ethics person, I'm not an engineer, you all are, or at least most of you on this call probably are, that failing to address these kinds of concerns, especially when they're safety related, can lead to serious, if not fatal, consequences. Now, a lot of what comes to mind when I'm thinking about this is autonomous vehicles. Now, of course, that's not the only example, but it does resonate with me because, of course, safety in autonomous vehicles is a life and death kind of matter. And one other thing I really haven't said much about today, but I hope would at least resonate or at least hope to draw your attention to it, is that these challenges are multifaceted, complex, evolving, difficult to understand, oftentimes difficult to formulate, and in my opinion, require the kinds of expertise that none of us individually have. So some of us obviously have expertise, I hope, in ethics, at least that's what I'm aiming for. Some of us will have expertise in the law. As I alluded to before, I'm not an attorney, and I would certainly need the assistance of attorneys to inform me on a lot of legal precedents. And of course, most of you here with us today have technical expertise, but can use the technical expertise of others, as you're well aware of when working in teams. So if you're an electrical engineer, you potentially could use a mechanical engineer, or perhaps a structures person. So building on that, we're going to need robust, diverse, inclusive types of expertise to make sure that these systems are built as safely as possible. As I often say, we will try to proceed with caution as AI and robots are being developed. A couple more quick things, and I'll just again, leave it over for some discussion. My references, if you're interested in any of what I discussed today, and some sample publications, if any of you want to read more about some of the sorts of things that I was discussing today. And these are works, the sampling of works that I've been part of. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the invitation. And do we have questions or comments?
At the moment, we don't have any more. I think we got quite a few in the middle, so that was good. I'll give everybody a chance here. If you have any other questions, we've had 36 people on, by the way, so pretty good attendance. So give everybody just another minute. I will say, oh, here comes something. Let's see here. John says, interesting, several ideas I never would have thought in creating an AI. Thanks for the great overview. And then
thank you, John.
Yeah, let's see, another a different John says, has IEEE's board found a professional engineer guilty of unprofessional conduct of having violated a rule or regulation related to intelligent systems?
I honestly can't answer that. I don't know. So I'm an IEEE member as an affiliate, and I've been involved in many IEEE activities, including speaking on autonomous vehicles, but I don't work for IEEE, so I don't actually know if they've had a scandal or the bad case, so to speak. I know that's often a reason that institutions or organizations create policies, but I actually don't know specifically if something has emerged at IEEE that motivated some of these conversations. I will tell you, just going back a couple slides, hopefully it's not too far, that this ethically aligned design, that the person who's in charge of it is John Havens, Havens. And if you're interested in learning more about what IEEE is doing, he is definitely the contact person. So again, his name is John Havens. So he's the person I often work with on IEEE related things. And he's essentially one of the people in charge of the ethically aligned design effort.
Okay. We have several folks chiming in saying thank you, from Richard and Bill and Phil and Roger, and we also have, let's see, where to go. Bill is asking, has the AI community looked for PEs to help in the development of AI?
So I think that's a good question. I don't know if it's happening as quickly as this community probably would like. I know there's been discussions in pockets here and there about having more PE involvement, for example, with autonomous vehicles. I know, and you on this call probably would know more about it than I would, but I had occasional conversations with people involved with NSPE who are interested in that space. But I don't know how much progress, I'm not the person to answer how much progress has been made to get PEs as part of the team. I think it obviously is an important discussion, but I'm not the person to answer how much progress has been made, unfortunately. I just don't know.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything. There is a task force that exists for autonomous vehicles within NSPE, and I used to see a fair amount of updates. I have not seen an update in the last handful of months at least. So I'm not sure either what's going on in there, at least from the NSPE side. Yeah. By the way, somebody has asked if the slides might be available for download.
Yeah, Steve, you and I can chat after that. It should be fine.
Okay, we'll find a way to try and get that out to everybody. Let's see, anybody else? Again, more thank yous, Sheila, and some others. So, okay, any other questions, folks? Yeah, Bill says thanks for the response. While we give everybody just another minute to see if they think of any other questions, I will at least throw in my 2 cents, and perhaps I'm a slightly biased because I have a minor in philosophy specializing in ethics and morals. Nothing compared to you, of course, but I've dabbled in it a little bit, and I find these topics especially intriguing, perhaps because of that background. So.
Well, thank you for reminding me of that. Yes, yeah. I think you told me that a while ago. But yes, yeah. I'm glad to hear that some of our engineers out there in the world have taken some philosophy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love hearing somebody with your depth of knowledge and expertise help kind of refresh me a little bit in some of that from school. So,
And it's amazing that sometimes us philosophers, yes, my training's in philosophy, if I didn't make that clear at the front end, we end up working with computer scientists and engineers. I work with quite a number of them, and I have been for quite a number of years now.
okay. Yeah, and this is just a logistical thing. Somebody's asking about the email address to get their certificate. And everybody, that's scrolling as a ticker on the bottom of the screen. And I'll have a slate up for a minute or so after we're done with that information as well. By the way, I would like to ask everybody, if you enjoyed this presentation, please do give it a thumbs up on YouTube. And click that bell icon, the notification icon, if you'd like to be notified of future events from GSPE. Let's see. Anybody else have any other questions? I think that's it for the moment. So with that, that's pretty much right on time too. You almost think you've done this in front of a classroom or two.
Yeah, occasionally.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, with that, then I want to say thank you very much. Pleasure as always, and we shall talk to you soon. Actually, I'll give you a call here in just a minute.
All right. Thank you all for the invitation, and hope you and your families are safe during these unusual times.
Okay. Thanks. Let's see. Let me switch something over here. New system, so I'm still kind of getting comfortable with it here. Let's see. All right.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation given at one of the Atlanta Metro meetings of the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers, an affiliate of the National Society of Professional Engineers. To find out more about us or to join us, check us out at gspe.org.